Next, Jonathan is invited. We are back to Enoch after a big tour with our mic text, but we're moving to the astronomical text, which is Jonathan Forte. He's doing other stuff as well, like Daniel, but we're going to hear from Enoch, right?
Every once in a while.
Every once in a while.
בסדר, אנחנו נמצא את זה. Do you find it? כן, כן, נביא אותו. Okay. Thank you, organizers. I think this is, we just spoken during the break, this is a very unique conference with people working in so many various fields, sitting together and interesting each other. I feel privileged to be here. And let me present some of the work on the Astronomical Book of Enoch, but in some ways I think it will relate to people working in other fields sitting in this room as well. I'd like to begin talking about literary criticism. When we talk of textual criticism of a text with multiple witnesses, we must ask, are we dealing with variants of the same text? Or are we dealing with attestations of a different text altogether? This question leads us to reconsider very fundamental questions of our profession, like the question, what is a text, a composition, a book? How do we know that we are dealing with the same book in various witnesses? I beg your pardon, and I will bring an example from biblical textual criticism. This is not the field, the theme of today's conference, but I think it might be helpful for us. So in 2 Samuel 2, David laments, הרי בגלבוע, על טל ועל מטר עליכם, ושדי תרומות. So he curses the mounts of Gilboa, that no dew or rain shall fall on them, and שדי תרומות, which nobody understands until this very day, what שדי תרומות is. At the same time, already H.L. Ginsberg said that, well, in Ugaritic, in the Akhat epic, there is a curse given to the area where Danailu died, where his son died. So he says, I cannot give the exact Ugaritic pronunciation. We will need Ed Greenstein for that. But it basically says, Bal tal bal matar, geshem, revav, bal sera teomotayim. So the Ugaritic phrase makes sense, yes, albeit consisting of difficult language. It was accordingly suggested by H.L. Ginsberg that the Hebrew phrase results from a corruption of the Canaanite one. Sedei terumot is an error for the Ugaritic sera tehomot, the expanse of underwater, water from the Apsu. The question is, though, can we say that the Ugaritic verse is a textual witness for 2 Samuel? Can we amend 2 Samuel on the basis of that Ugaritic witness? My teacher, Shmariyahu Talmon, once wrote an interesting essay about that. The Ugaritic epic does not attest the same text or book as 2 Samuel. Therefore, what had once existed as a curse formula was absorbed in biblical literature, maybe in a corrupt way. Maybe it already entered from its very inception into biblical literature, into Samuel, in a corrupt way as Sedei Terumot. It is interesting, so this Ugaritic text might be interesting as a prehistory of the curse formula, but not for the history of the book of Samuel. If one wanted to trace the history of the curse formula, then the Ugaritic verse should be very significant. It is less significant if one writes to study the text history of 2 Samuel. Let us now move to Enoch. So we have quite a few textual witnesses for the text of the astronomical book. We have copies from Qumran in Aramaic. We have a highly fragmentary and somewhat doubtful fragment of the Greek. We have a very extensive Ethiopic version, known today as part of 1 Enoch. This latter version is only attested from the late medieval period, as we heard today, but likely has ancient roots. There are also later Ethiopic commentaries, but they will not concern us much here. Can all of these writings be considered copies of the astronomical book? Let me just say that instead of saying astronomical book, I will call it AB, and I hope you can follow that. This treatise lived through such a variegated history of transmission, both in terms of its contents and in terms of the context in which it appeared, that one may hardly see it as one stable entity throughout its long history. Let me name two most significant developments, one in each of the categories just mentioned. AB began its life as a science book. It is a Levantine Aramaic consolidation of popular Babylonian astronomy. Like other Aramaic treatises, it was part of a larger cultural movement by which the riches of cuneiform culture appeared in new garb and with some modifications, this time in Aramaic. For example, Mesopotamian historical narratives appeared in Aramaic in Papyrus Amherst 63. Proverbs from Gilgamesh appear in Kohelet, and well, Neely Summit just recently claimed that it might have gone through Aramaic, an interesting idea. Babylonian magic appears in the incantation balls and in Mandei compositions as studied by many, James Nathan Ford recently, and Babylonian astronomy appears in Aramaic in the astronomical book discussed here today. Henrik Dravnel has shown conclusively how much this book depends on the models of Enuma Anu and Enlil 14. And I suggested a few other things, strengthening the connection and pointing out some differences. But in contrast to this early scientific Levantine treatise, the book at some stage became part of the collection we call 1 Enoch, and accumulated changes and editorial passages which conform to this new setting. For example, the narrative chapter 81, and certainly the apocalyptic admonition in chapter 80, only appear in Ethiopic and reflect, at least partly, the editorial interests of 1 Enoch in general, as Nickelsburg thinks. While these two editions can be easily isolated and maybe removed if you wish, other sections of AB may also be part of the same agenda, so the general 1 Enoch agenda. So, are we writing a history of an Aramaic scientific treatise or of a section of the Ethiopic biblical book of 1 Enoch? A major difference in terms of content is well known, and I will rehearse it here but only shortly. The core of AB is a long treatise in Aramaic, which gives day by day, for all days of the year, and maybe also more than 1 year, a daily series of data. This roster is commonly called the synchronistic calendar, but this is a wrong name, and I will just call it here today the roster. Roster is called Reshima, the list. This is an attestation of one example of that, but it appears in several others, we will say. The data contained in the roster primarily involve the periods, do I have it here? Yes. The periods of visibility of the moon throughout daytime and nighttime, measured from sunrise and sunset. These measurements are an immediate continuation of the Babylonian system. Another element of this series is the place of the moon in the 12 heavenly gates, that is, its place on the horizon. The place of the sun in the heavenly gates is mentioned only sporadically in the roster. Much variation is encountered regarding these elements in the Ethiopic astronomical book. The roster per se is no longer represented. A variety of techniques is used in order to create passages and replacing that roster in the later Ethiopic text. So we can say that for lunar data, instead of a sequence of numerical data for each day in Aramaic, the Ethiopic book represents isolated sentences from that roster and constructs paragraphs around them. These paragraphs do not cover all days of the year, but rather relate mainly to the days around the beginning and middle of the month. Moreover, these passages are not concentrated in one continuous section of AB, but rather appear in two alternative blocks in it, as you have there. Finally, the periods of lunar visibility, the major part of the Aramaic roster, are entirely lost in Ethiopic. No more periods of lunar visibility. You have to look very hard in order to find it in the Ethiopic text. Where you read the Ethiopic, it is mainly about how much light is there in the moon during the days of the month. But you would need to Henrik Dravnel to explain and to discover that this is what the text really talks about. In terms of solar data, while tracking the place of the sun on the horizon had only been a marginal and sporadic interest of the Aramaic roster, the present astronomical book studies this phenomenon in a very detailed chapter, chapter 72, the opening chapter of the entire treatise. Here one sees an elaborate and consistent system of heavenly gates and the sun's movement through them. Note that the passage of the moon through the heavenly gates, what had been the core of the Aramaic roster, is not as explicitly treated in the Ethiopic. In fact, what we know only comes from later Ethiopic commentaries collected by Neugebauer. Returning to the sun, given the marginality of the solar positions in the Aramaic fragments, the originality of the detailed Ethiopic chapter 72, I think, is in some doubt. Again, one may ask, what do you mean by originality? So I just said the word originality. So if I prepare an edition of the early astronomical book, it will most probably not, well, probably I think not contain the solar element. But an edition of the Ethiopic book should no doubt contain it. When was the solar section created? It might have been created in Ethiopic or in Greek. We don't know enough about the Greek stage. But we should be aware that a book containing only a list of lunar visibility is different from a more literary creation commencing with a comprehensive account of the gates and so on and so forth. These two large differences are enough to demonstrate that the object we call the astronomical book is not a stable entity. What Ulrich calls in biblical criticism multiple literary editions seems to be valid here. Differences do not attest to variant readings of the same text, but rather to discrete literary editions. If I prepared a critical edition of this book for Ron Hendel in his SBL Hebrew Bible, I would place much of the book AB in parallel columns because no urtext could be suggested for such variegated materials. I will now focus my attention on several points in which the interests of various redactors could be detected. My first point is to show that multiple literary editions of this astronomical material are not a late phenomenon that appeared in translations, but rather an early phenomenon existing already in Aramaic. I made this claim already in my dissertation, and I will add some to it. Let us begin with this scroll 4Q209. This nice Herodian scroll is a superbly executed copy, a deluxe scroll, as Emmanuel Tov calls it. The script is square and consistent. Aramaic grammar and orthography are all standardized. This scroll, apparently quite long, features interesting contents. While a part of the scroll represents the bare Aramaic roster, the list of figures, date by day, name by name, number after number, another part of this scroll preserves the abridged lunar sections of the astronomical book as we defined them earlier. Almost identical to what they are in Ethiopic. Not identical, but very similar. Therefore, prose versions of AB, so prose as opposed to lists, prose versions of AB did already exist in Aramaic in the 1st century BCE. They were contained alongside the Aramaic roster in at least one scroll. These rewritten sections contain another significant change vis-a-vis the older Aramaic roster. The prose sections of this version are headed, as attested in several examples, by instruction-like phrases, similar to those of the Ethiopic AB. So, for example, these ones, testamentary statements. I will show you that, my son. He has showed him another calculation. And they are similar to what's found in 1 Enoch, Ethiopia. Such testamentary statements are not attested in the earlier scroll, 4Q208, which we will see immediately. Admittedly, that scroll is rather fragmentary, so we might be careful about it, but enough remained in order to make clear that it only contains scientific material numbers and figures without literary framing. So I think, yes, this is 208. I try to make a clear argument. Testamentary formulas are not found in the Aramaic roster. Such formulas can only be found in the reworked sections that appear in the second half of AB. This diversification leads me to suggest that the astronomical material had originally circulated without any narrative or testamentary framework. The latter was added to it in Aramaic-speaking Jewish circles as the Enoch material was taking testamentary form. Testamentary form similar to what we heard today. This idea connects with the theory of Nickelsburg, but the exact relation with Nickelsburg is not dealt here. If this is the case, what then can we make of the early scroll, this one, that contains only the astronomical list? It seems that this dating, it also says it appears very early in Dan's list that we just got today. Perhaps we can say that this scroll is not a copy of AB, but maybe rather a precursor of AB. It would be a pre-sectarian scroll, which could in fact represent a kind of a shared, maybe even pre-Jewish Aramaic heritage of the Levant. It is useful to add that the script and scribal practices of 4Q208 are outstanding in the more or less stable Qumranic scribal tradition. The orthography is not stabilized, and the scribal practices, whatever. So we can say that 208 here represents a precursor of AB, while 209 comes closer to what we call the astronomical book. Let us now examine another trajectory, a whole different trajectory of the astronomical book, in yet another scroll, 4Q211. The situation with this scroll is somewhat difficult, so we need to clarify it quite carefully with regard to chapter 82 of 1 Enoch. So we'll go back to this image later on, but here is chapter 82. So in chapter 82, we have a general statement about the year. Then we have stellar or angelic, both stellar and angelic, I think, leaders of time periods and their order. And then a detailed description of each season, its leaders and its weather signs. Notably, 2 seasons survive in this last section. This is all, yes, this is what we have in Ethiopic, yes? 2 seasons, the spring and the summer, and you have the text there. There's the name of the leader, there is the agricultural and weather conditions during that season, and then again, the leaders of that, the angelic leaders of that season. Other seasons are not preserved in Ethiopic, and the entire astronomical book ends somewhat abruptly. Many scholars actually believe that this part actually belonged before chapter 79, but this is not the question here. Another season, I think probably a 4th season, the winter, appears in the first column of 4Q211. Please excuse me the presentation, but it's not graphically identical, but this is what it is. Milik concluded that this section continues the continuation of chapter 82. This is what the description of winter. He then designated 4Q211 as a copy of the astronomical book. Let's consider the text of winter here. It contains a detailed description of weather and agriculture. It connects well with 1 Enoch chapter 2 in terms of the trees and so on. But it does not preserve anything about the angelic or stellar leader of the season. Well, it might be an evidence of absence, but here we don't have a leader. We only have weather phenomena, but no leader. It seems to me that at this point, 4Q211 presents an earlier edition of the astronomical book, which paid little attention to the stellar leaders and focused on the weather. The Ethiopic preserves an expanded edition, giving more attention to the leaders. I wrote it in some other place that edition giving more attention to the stellar leaders and the hierarchy of the leaders is a product of maybe the Greek transmission, because this is what you find there with the hierarchy of the leaders of the times. This is very similar to the kind of things you find in Roman or Hellenistic Egypt with leaders of the decans, stellar, angelic, stellar divine leaders of the seasons. I think this kind of redaction took place in the Greek. This is what I suggested. I'm not entirely sure, but I actually like that suggestion, so I brought it here. Let me move on and say that like the first column of 4Q211, also the remaining two columns do not correspond to any known version of the astronomical book. This obscure text contains a series of fractions, possibly measuring the risings of stars according to some calculations of ours. The series uses Babylonian-like fractions based mainly on fractions of 30, 60, and 90. Curiously, it is the earliest attestation of fractions in Aramaic that we have. This type of stellar text is not known elsewhere from the AB known to us, neither known from Qumran, where mentions of individual stars are avoided. In fact, it found no continuity in any tradition known to us: Aramaic, Hebrew, Ethiopic, even Greek, as far as I know. It is sui generis. If, as Melik thought, column 1 of the same scroll is a continuation of chapter 82, then one would expect these ensuing columns to connect to the same theme. This is not the case, however, as chapter 82 mentions the stars only in a programmatic theological way, leading the seasons, but never goes into numerical calculations there. So how do we explain these columns of 4Q211 with relation to the astronomical book? There are two ways. One way is to say that this scroll contains a commentary, a commentary on the astronomical book, or some elaboration of it. We know many such commentaries from the cuneiform tradition, where commentaries on astronomical texts are very ubiquitous. And so if this is a commentary, then that should make Uri Gabay very happy. Trying to see how many people got the joke. Few did. However, there is another way to explain 4Q211, a more elaborate way, which reminds us of the way biblical scholars think, or Pentateuch scholars think. It makes sense to say that the original Aramaic tradition did in fact contain a stellar section on the stars, in which such calculations were the norm. Such a section would correspond to the formula of 1 Enoch 79:1. Now, my son, I have shown you everything, and the law of all the stars of the sky is completed. In the current AB in Ethiopic, this concluding line remains void as no law of stars is mentioned. This Mysterian columns of 4Q211 may have been that missing part mentioned in that 1 Enoch 79. So if this is the case, and the earliest AB did contain a stellar part, like we have here, then that stellar part might have been taken away in the tradition that eventually reached the Ethiopic. Why was it taken away? It might have been taken away because of theological reasons, trying to avoid the worship of stars and so on. It might also have been taken away because it was too difficult mathematically. The Book of Enoch, the tradition that we have, is very simple mathematically. This goes 2 steps forward, and it might have been that the Trojans just couldn't get it, and they left it out, and left just general vague statements about the stars without any calculations. Let us now collect the threads of the entire discussion. So I've been presenting all sorts of ideas, and this is astronomical material that not everybody's used to working with. So let me collect some general thoughts. The entity called the astronomical book has always suffered from a rather shaky and frail identity. This is the case not only in the transition from Aramaic to Greek and Ethiopic, but already in the Aramaic stage of transmission. In fact, while we know little about the Greek and Ethiopic stages, we do know something about the Aramaic one. What may be best called the Aramaic astronomical book is the composition contained in the scroll 4Q209. This scroll represents both the Aramaic roster and the more literary Aramaic sections later contained in the Ethiopic book. This combination, using testamentary formulas, seems to constitute the earliest composition which contained some sort of literary and religious character. Such a composition may have been contained also in 4Q210. It's a fragmentary scroll, and I didn't show it here, and so it's not part of the discussion today. 2 other copies of AB stand out. There's the earliest copy, 4Q208. It seems to be a precursor of the book, representing only the list, only the roster, without remains of literary or testamentary framework in a very early scroll. What seems like expansions or commentaries in 4Q to 11 in fact represent an earlier layer, closer to an original AB. The differences between the layer and the AB, known to us, have to do with stellar sections of the book. Stellar calculations were left out, giving way to more elaboration on the theological, mythological roles of stars and angels. The most prominent act in a later, maybe Greek or Egyptian transmission, was the authorship of chapter 72. This systematic solar section was placed at the beginning of the book, giving it much of its character. There were additional substantial developments in the lunar sections as well, but time will not suffice for that today. Thank you very much.